Not again.
Hello? Again?
Again.
What's again?
Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. Today we're talking to Tom Bunyard about Guy Debord and the Situationist International. This session was recorded on the 1st of February 2022 as part of the Exploding Appendix avant-garde practice and research groups free weekly meetup. We have more on our website explodingappendix.com, and you can join our meetups in Brighton or online on Zoom, and find us on SoundCloud, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook and Eventbrite. Now the interview.
A big thank you for Tom for coming and joining us today. Real pleasure to have you here, and a real pleasure to be reading your book, Debord, Time and the Spectacle. Really great read, really fascinating, in-depth engagement with some of the sort of philosophical ideas of Guy Debord. Yeah, I mean, that gives us a sort of challenge because it's quite an in-depth book to sort of do a relatively relaxed, chatty discussion of it, but I think it is a book that's really worth engaging with, especially in terms of getting the sort of philosophical underpinnings of Guy Debord's work. I think we'll talk a bit more later about how Guy Debord especially is often seen as a media theorist, and I suppose from an art perspective that's quite useful, and the Situationists are often seen as an art movement. From an art perspective is quite useful, but it's quite nice as well, or very useful, to be able to sort of engage with them in a broader philosophical way, and I think that also helps us sort of situate some of the ideas around art and media within their work. I hope we can sort of get into that today. I think I will start with, I suppose, what hopefully a relatively easy question, which is, who is Guy Debord and what is the Situationist International?
Thank you very much for coming. I'm really glad to be here. We're glad to be invited. Very kind of Bradley. Yeah, as he said, he's sent me a sort of series of really good questions, and because they're really good questions, some of them are quite hard and they're quite chunky. There's quite a lot of unpacking involved in some of them. I've been a bit worried about this actually, because there seems like there's quite an awful lot of intellectual history you have to unpack to answer something. So the first thing, who were the Situationists? Well, Debord is an art theorist, critic, filmmaker, and identifies very much as a revolutionary, absolutely political activist. That's absolutely kind of central to the whole thing. And the Situationist International, they started up within the kind of the avant-garde milieu, and then became increasingly oriented towards really militant revolutionary praxis throughout the kind of 1960s. So Debord is born in 1931, dies in 94. The Situationists formed in 1957 and carried through to 1972 when they split. Debord, just to kind of quickly give you kind of a rundown of this person. Okay, so he's born in 31, born in Paris, moves to Cannes fairly early on, goes to school in Cannes. While he's there, gets very interested in kind of surrealism, the legacy of surrealism, avant-garde, starts a big fan of Launchemont from a very early age. At the age of 19, he goes to the film festival, 1951, and while he's at the film festival in Cannes, he meets someone called Isidore Isou, who's a figure from the kind of Parisian avant-garde. And Isou is there with his group called the Lettrists, the letterists, often translated in English. And he's got this kind of strange, provocative film that he's trying to show at Cannes. Debord is really impressed with these guys because they're all kind of swaggering and kind of avant-garde and kind of cocky young men, I think, really. And he's quite taken with this. And he decides he wants to join up. So he goes to Paris and becomes a member of the group. And then in 52, he makes his first film. His first film is called, translated into English as Howlings in Favour of Sade, Marquis de Sade. And it's provocative, to put it kind of mildly. It's like it just goes between black screen and a white screen. When the white screen comes on, you get a bit of dialogue, and then the black screen, just kind of silence. And the film ends with 24 minutes of nothing. And then it just kind of stops. So it was provocative, to say the least. He becomes kind of influential in this movement. The Lettrists International splits with in 1952, kind of goes his own way, and he starts his own kind of splinter group, which he calls Lettrist International, the Lettrist International. And while he's in the Lettrist International, he and his mates put together some of the ideas that become really, really central to the Situationist International later on, ideas which I'd imagine people have probably come across before. Ideas like psychogeography, which has become quite famous, has had a bit of an afterlife. The dérive, drifting through the city. The idea of détournement, which has had quite a long history afterwards. And he's also got the beginnings of his ideas about spectacle. there and the notion of the situation. This is all kind of bubbling away. In 56, they organised what they very grandly called the First World Congress of Free Artists. And you get a bunch of different kind of avant-garde groups from around Europe who all kind of decided they're kind of moving in the same kind of general direction, and they decide they're going to unite. And then the following year in 57, they get together in Italy again. Debord spent a good part of that year, I think, writing a document called the Report on the Construction of Situations. And this becomes a bit like a kind of sort of a founding document. They go to the meeting in 57, and he kind of reads them this document, and they'll go, yes, this is, sounds like a plan. And they kind of, that then becomes a kind of a founding kind of document. And what it basically argues is that the surrealist kind of promise of uniting art and life needs to be fulfilled. That still needs to be kind of carried through. That kind of art and culture kind of lost their way, they've become stagnant and stuck. That needs to be kind of carried through. And the way to do that is not so much, to put it simply, is not just to kind of make paintings or sculptures or things like that. It's to start making moments of life, deliberately constructing moments of life. Hence the notion of constructing situations. But they quite quickly get into the idea that you're living in a society in which you're prevented from doing this, right? That there's a worry that modern society, modern life is kind of fixed and stagnant and stuck in various ways. So they start getting quite keen on the idea that you need to create social change in order to create this kind of next stage where we need to go to. So very quickly, Debord starts gravitating towards the idea that what's really required is a pretty militant social revolution. By the late 1950s, he's getting very heavily involved in reading Marx and Hegel and Lukács, that kind of stuff. And by 1962, you have a split in the group where Debord pretty much kicks out most of the artists, primarily the Scandinavian and German artists. After that time, the group kind of solidifies around him and around his ideas and around his kind of theoretical ideas. And it becomes more and more oriented towards kind of really quite radical social theory and a commitment towards creating kind of grand revolutionary change. In 1965, he starts working on his main book, The Society of the Spectacle. That's published in 1967. The following year, you have the events in May 1968, which Debord kind of sees almost this, not quite confirmation of what he's saying, but near enough, kind of, I told you so kind of thing. 1972, the group splits. They kind of think that they've kind of had their moment, really. And Debord carries on. His ideas pretty much stay the same, getting a bit more kind of maudlin as we go on. He writes another book in 1988, which is quite important, called Comments on the Society of the Spectacle, which is a set of reflections, not on his older book, The Society of the Spectacle, but on the Society of the Spectacle, how it's changed, which I think is a book that actually deserves to be reread quite a lot nowadays, which is quite prescient in some respects. He carries on making films, doing his books and all the rest of this stuff, and eventually dies in 1994. He's an alcoholic, and the complications of his alcoholism was just too much by the end of it, and he commits suicide.
For Anglophone audiences, the Situationist International are often viewed as an avant-garde art movement that takes up where Dada, Surrealism, the letterists left off by using sort of different devices like détournement, psychogeography, some forms of participation, and to sort of challenge the distinction between art and everyday life. Likewise, Guy Debord is often seen as a kind of media theorist, critiquing mass media and advertising as a kind of spectacle. So your book takes a kind of different approach, showing that the Situationists were far more than an art movement, and Guy Debord far more than a kind of media theorist. Yet by sort of stripping away some of these associations and explaining the sort of philosophical core of the Situationist International, the book draws out a kind of different kind of aesthetics and art theory of the Situationists. One that seems sort of intimately tied with other themes of sort of philosophy and revolution. So you write that we saw earlier that the Situationist International was not, and indeed could not be, an art movement in any traditional sense of the term. Indeed, they sought to function as the final avant-garde, as an avant-garde that would abolish itself qua avant-garde by opening a revolutionary path towards that which lay beyond the extant forms of art, culture, and society. So how should we understand the conception of this sort of last avant-garde or this final avant-garde? And how should we relate it to the Situationist International's understanding of art, philosophy, and revolution?
Probably the easiest way into this is to say a bit about that founding document, Report on the Construction of Situations, because it kind of lays out a set of ideas that he very broadly kind of stuck to. part of it relies on the idea that there's a bit of an art history thing going on here, perhaps. And the idea is, I think, sorry, jumping around a bit, I'm drawing this from some of the stuff he says later on as well, but if you put it together, you get the overall picture. But he's of the view that around the sort of the 1920s, 1930s, around the beginning of the 20th century, there's a moment of real possibility that the revolutionary movement, the revolutionary workers' movement, which has been growing and getting kind of strong, could unite with the avant-garde, and that could end up creating an entirely new way of life, kind of a communism, not the kind of the meat and two-veg communism where we just can take control of the means of production, but a kind of a much grander, much more utopian notion of communism, where art and life really might become one. The idea is really that art has been killing itself off as a means of representing life and starting to gesture towards making life effectively. And this might be coinciding perhaps with sort of the political stuff that's kind of happening at the time. But you get this idea that moment of potential was lost. The revolution kind of fails, the commodity wins, art and culture, as far as Debord is concerned, turns into what he calls a condition of decomposition, a stagnation, empty repetition. Things just kind of stay the same, they're kind of stuck. It's kind of boring and kind of stagnant. And this notion of decomposition, I think, is very closely mixed in with the roots of his later notion of spectacle, to become stagnant, stuck. So you get this kind of idea that in order to kind of move things forward, in order to kind of, if what we need to do is unite art and life and create situations and all the rest of these things, we've got to get beyond this way of life, this moment of society, because it's stuck and fixed and stagnant. It's shaped by kind of patterns of experience and interaction and all the rest of it, which are kind of stuck into the templates and molds, which need to be kind of broken in some respects. So you start to get the idea that what's really required is grand social change. The Situationists initially were quite interested in experimenting to try and investigate what a new mode of life might be like, the possibilities of creating situations, experiences, moments of lived time. But increasingly, they get more and more drawn towards the idea that what we've really got to do is figure out how the society works so we can figure out how to change it. Right? So that then becomes the kind of the trajectory. So you start to get this kind of idea that if the avant-garde is going to kind of resolve problems with art and culture and move everything forward, then the avant-garde has to start becoming almost like a revolutionary movement, start turning into something really like almost like a political vanguard in some ways. It has to kind of move things forward. Maybe rather than kind of producing paintings, you really might want to be kind of producing critical theory, something like that. And that's certainly Debord's trajectory. That's part of the split with the artists in 1962. So they start to say things like this, that there's a kind of lovely, I forget the date of this one, but one of the quotations, he says, not him, one of the Situationists says, we're artists insofar as we are no longer artists. We come to fulfill art. Destroy art as something separate from life, as a means of representing life, in order to realise it as a means of making life. But that ambition is intimately wedded to a kind of a political project. So there's a connection between revolution and there's the idea of being the last avant-garde. It's sort of like finishing art off as something that's about representing life in order to realise art as lived time.
The hardest thing I find to get my head around in that is that you could sort of say something similar around pubs, right? You could say that we want to have the last pub. Since the pubs become part of life, but then also pubs are also quite interesting to go to as pubs. So I suppose that's the tension I have in the same way with art, like actually going to a cinema or going to, it's a kind of different experience. So yes, you would want art to become life to become much more like an artist or aesthetic experience. But it also seems like there might be something like in terms of
I'm not sure that he really thinks no one should ever make a painting ever again, because that's a bit draconian. I think part of the split of the artists, I think part of it is trying to hang on to the term Situationist International. He was very worried that I think it's either the Germans or the Scandinavians, I forget which, were sort of turning it into a kind of an ism, into kind of an art movement, and kind of killing it off as something kind of spiky. It was becoming neutralised in some sense. So that's part of what was kind of going on there. And there's where's he from? Scandinavian guy, Danish, I think. Mikkel Bolt Rasmussen, I think his name is. He's done quite a lot of work on the art side of the SI. And one of the things he was pointing out is that there is a kind of this situation to do with kind of an exhibition artist with the artists, where they're doing these kind of things which are a bit like art objects, and they say they're kind of not the rest of it. So it's a bit fuzzy. I don't think they mean you must never make painting ever again. I think it becomes much more like like the idea of trying to create a kind of a richer lived experience.
Yeah. So in the 50s and 60s, sort of art movements such as like Happenings, Fluxus, Feeney's Actionism, Ephemeral Panic, and many more sort of explored and experimented with temporality and even take their sort of their names or their titles from temporality. So sort of likewise, situationists were also sort of exploring temporality and taking their name from it. So what for the situationists was a situation, and how does this sort of inform their particular aesthetics of time?
So I'm nothing like as good as I really ought to be on the other art movements you mentioned, right? I'm not. I mean, but the connection is the performance art stuff, conceptual art stuff is all going to move away from kind of making objects and away from making things that can be bought and sold. So it's definitely part of that kind of pattern of that kind of movement. But a big ingredient that kind of feeds into what the Situationists are doing is French existentialism. Right? This is kind of, you've got kind of the legacy, the kind of the ambience of Sartre and that lot. And although Debord despised Sartre, he's incredibly rude about Sartre, really kind of thought he was the piss. He takes a lot from him, an awful lot from him. So the idea of the kind of the situation, I think a big part of that is coming from the existential lineage. Broadly speaking, the idea would be, summarising a lot at the same time, it's an existential idea. You're kind of thrown into the kind of the situations that compose your life. You need to kind of choose, decide, act within them, orientate yourself towards your future, and all the rest of this kind of stuff. And the Situationists were saying, well, actually, no, you need to create situations. Now, is it also worth saying, actually, Debord was talking about this really from the age of about 20, 21, I think, as I remember. He's got his ideas about constructing situations really, really early on. But yeah, it's coming out of kind of bits of existentialism. It's infused with this idea of the unification of art and life, which is coming out of surrealism. And it's also later on gets this kind of heavy dose of kind of Marx and Hegel, some of which can be indicated by quite a nice phrase. I think this is a much later, where they say the philosophers and the artists have only interpreted situations. The point is to transform them. Those who recognise it, that's a reference back to one of Marx's most famous lines, the final thesis on Feuerbach, which is the philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. It's not about describing the world, interpreting the world. You need to kind of use ideas in order to transform the world. So they're saying the same thing about the construction of situations. You need to kind of make lived time, essentially, or make an experience within time. So we get this idea that where Marx is interested in kind of the realization of philosophy, where critical thought about the world becomes a means of actually changing the world. Something similar might be happening with the realization of art, right? That kind of thing. But you also asked about aesthetics, the aesthetics of time, and there is something like that that runs through all of his kind of work, I think, right from the beginning. Certainly, as I read him, he's I don't know, he's time, temporality, the experience of time is a kind of a continual theme right the way through the whole all of his work, and it is tied to a kind of an aesthetic of some sort, a kind of beauty of some kind, the experience of the passage of time, the passage through moments of experience, moments that compose life. So what's that like? It's a kind of some people describe it as melancholic. There's a guy called Vincent Kaufman who wrote quite a good book called Poetry in the Service of Revolution, which is quite a good book about the world. And he characterizes this as being quite melancholic. And there is a bit of that, because part of it is about the kind of the pathos that comes from moments of time sliding into the past. But it's not melancholic. It's also quite joyful and playful and creative. It is oriented towards the future. It's about making the future. There's a big theme about kind of chance, danger, risk, play. The experience of time as it passes, the need to act and intervene within time as it kind of passes. And ultimately, I think there's a big theme of hedonism. It's really about enjoying time, playing with time as it kind of passes by, with perhaps a sense of kind of pathos mixed into that.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of pleasure, but there's also an element of revolution.
Oh, yeah.
That balance between, and theory and revolution, I suppose, balance between that too, but certainly in terms of engagement. In The Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord writes that the spectacle cannot be understood as a mere visual excess produced by mass media and technologies, or mass media technologies. So if the spectacle cannot be reduced to the mass media, what is it?
But Debord never really explains his terms. He never deigns to do this. He leaves it for kind of people like us to try to figure it out. So what is spectacle? I'm stressing this point because lots of people read it in different ways, and I'll outline the way in which I read it. First of all, a lot of people still to this day view it as very much a work of media. And that's at least partly informed by the cover of the old 1971, I think it is, black and red pirate copy, which is lots of people sitting in a cinema with these kind of 3D glasses in front of their eyes. He's talking about images, he's talking about representations, all the rest of this kind of thing. So the kind of assumption is, well, he's talking about TV screens. Surely this is essentially a kind of critique of modern visual culture, and it is. He's not. It's not that he's not doing that. He is talking about contemporary capitalist vision. The point is, he's not just doing that, right? That's seen as a symptom of a much broader set. I think you get further into it when you look at the way in which it's drawing on Marx and Marx's ideas about commodity fetishism. That side of the story follows from the sense in which he thinks this is a society in which our actions, our interactions, our aspirations, our desires, in some respects our identities are shaped by the dictates of the commodity in various ways, resulting in a kind of a form of life which kind of suits the needs of the economy. This gives you a sense in which we become, it gives you a sense in which the notion of spectatorship is being a kind of a passive observer of one's own life. And that means that this notion of we are spectators of our own life doesn't mean that you watch proxies on screens. It means that you're actually alienated. But I think we get a bit more out of it if we look at the way in which that relates to his ideas about time and some of the philosophical dimensions of the work that he's drawing on. One way of kind of sketching that out, which I've used quite heavily, probably too heavily actually, but there's a letter in 73, and when he explains his terms, you've got to kind of pounce on it because they don't happen very often. But there's a letter of 73, I think he's either writing to a reader of the South Spectrum or a translator, I can't remember. But he says, we need to think about it as having 3 degrees, which I kind of take as kind of 3 levels. There's simple media ideological appearances, there's the moment of the mode of production, and then thirdly, there's, what does he call it? He calls it history itself, right? This is a moment of history. And I think that's the deepest aspect of the whole issue, of the whole kind of package. I think the theory of spectacle is ultimately a story about a society that's become separated from its own history, from its own existence in historical time, but that means not just thought about the past, but rather the possibility of making history, a kind of an orientation towards the future. The idea is that agency of various ways has been kind of lost to an economic system that is in charge of life. We're kind of passengers, essentially. We're not really in charge of the ship. And we become passive observers of a mode of life which we're not really in control of. This gives you this kind of idea. The book is fundamentally about history, about separation from history. And this, I think, gives you a bit of a clue as to why he talks about time so much in the book. He does talk about commodities, and there are a few references to kind of the visual and the visual images and stuff like this. But he's also got 2 entire chapters about time, and he's referring to history all the way through. And if he's just talking about media imagery, it's quite hard to explain why he would be talking about time and why his chapter on time goes all the way back to the Neolithic. Strange, right? I think ultimately what it comes down to is a critique of forms of social relations in which collectivities of people become subordinate to their own collective power. Maybe the easy way to sketch that out quickly and simply is one of the big influences on Debord is an old young Hegelian philosopher called Ludwig Feuerbach. And Feuerbach, put it really simply, has a kind of critique of religion where he says when you worship God, you're really worshipping a representation of our own collective powers and capacities which have been projected onto the heavens, which we then bow down to and become subordinate. I think that's really kind of the essence of some of what kind of falls up, right? And he's saying that the collective powers and capacities of this society, all the things that we can be and do, our capacity to shape and determine our own time, have become abdicated to an economic system which we're not fully in control of. But he doesn't just talk about it in terms of the commodity. He talks about this kind of problem, kind of the separation of collective power, the separation of social power, when describing religion, when describing hierarchy, when describing ideology. And if you look through some of his writings, he actually kind of traces this problem all the way back into the past. There's a letter, another one from the 1970s, where he says the roots of the spectacle go all the way back to antiquity, right? So this is a long-standing problem. It seems to be rooted in human sociality. And the problem is, conditions in which collectivities of people become separated from and subordinate to their own collective powers and capacities due to the nature of the social relations in which they're existing and interacting. That problem results in an inability to shape and direct collectively lived time, and it gives you the idea that the resolution of that problem is not going to be some kind of let's go out and smash the TV screens. It's actually about a strange kind of vision of kind of communism, which is almost like history becomes self-conscious, kind of collective self-conscious condition. This is why he says things like history itself is the spectre haunting modern society. That's a reference to the Communist Manifesto, Communism, the spectre haunting Europe. He says history is the spectre haunting modern society. There's a letter to the Italian part of the Situationist International, which he says that historical time is the milieu and the goal of the proletarian revolution. The aim is to take control of time. So you have this strange kind of idea that this is a society that's separated from its own existence in time and needs to take charge. So to summarize, spectacle, as I understand it, is a way of thinking about the separation of collective activities of people from their own collective powers and capacities. That would relate to the commodity, it relates to media screens and TV screens and all the rest of it, but it also relates to revolutionary figureheads, the leadership, the hierarchy, and all the rest of these things that the situations weren't so keen on. Instead, what they're after is a condition of kind of collective self-determination of one sort or another.
So when he talks about taking control of time, or the idea of taking control of history, is that taking control of history as something present now, as something being made now, or is it taking control of history as something past?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. So I should have said this. I think he doesn't spell this out. This is just me trying to interpret what he said. He's using history all the way. The term history appears throughout the writings, and the way in which I interpret it is he's not thinking about history just as a bunch of information about what's happened in the past, and not just as the discipline of studying what's happened in the past, but thinking instead as what we do in time. And if it's what we do in time, it's something that we continue to do, right? But it's not necessarily something that we're fully in charge of, according to this view.
Yeah, so almost like how Hegel would talk about Geist.
Yes, if you like, yeah. But I mean, there's a big deal of Lukács here. So with Lukács, the idea of the proletariat become conscious of the fact that they're kind of making a way of life. They can do so collectively and consciously. You've got something very, very similar, but it's stitched into this story about constructing situations. So there's a bridge between this story and the older avant-garde stuff about the need to construct situations. So I should have said that. Sorry. So this kind of grand vision of some kind of a new way of life. There's a direct connection to the idea of constructing situations. This is what it's starting to turn into as he goes into his more theoretical period.
What do you think his kind of response would be to something which would be sort of like maybe a Foucauldian kind of criticism? For example, okay, we're in this sort of world historical moment where we need to construct something in order to take charge of history and sort of in some way become the rudder which steers it. But then what's his response to saying that we are actually sort of as much part of that spectacle, the way that we speak through our social institutions, our social structures?
I think he'd accept a great deal of that without going all the way into kind of Foucault territory, because he didn't like Foucault very much at all. Okay. Because he's too much of a Hegelian and the Marxist, for a start. In Paris, in the Bibliothèque Nationale, they've got all of his kind of reading notes. This massive archive of stuff he was reading. And there's great slabs of stuff on psychology, psychoanalysis and stuff like this. He's very interested in all this kind of stuff. The way in which we might be kind of shaped in various ways by the way in which we think. And he's kind of gesturing towards that in some of his films as well. So he's not dismissing this view that all of a sudden we see totally clearly and everything becomes wonderful. Although I think it would be fair to worry that some bits of the theory do point in that direction. So when you get nervous about this kind of idea of some of this might sound a little bit kind of scary, grandly totalitarian, onwards to the future, I know the answer. I think you could probably develop that challenge.
Kind of like a hopeful kind of creating in order to stop the way things just progressing in a linear kind of way. The act of creating a new situation is a way of stopping that from just, or am I thinking too much in terms of like critical theory, kind of wanting to stop history because history is a negative thing?
I don't think he thinks history is a negative thing. I don't think that at all. I think he thinks history is what we are, what we do. I mean, he's more Hegelian kind of sort of humanist existential than that kind of sort of Foucault stuff. And I think it's more the idea, history is what we are, what we do. I mean, that's one of the ways in which you might think about Hegel, right? We are what we do in time, we are our own history. We can become more and more self-conscious and able to shape and determine our own existence in time. That's one way to think about what Debord is up to. But he's thinking that this needs to happen as a kind of collective project. There's a Marxist dimension to this because there's something about the society which is undermining that and preventing it. It requires social change.
As an art movement, you might want to create these kind of lived experiences where art and life collapse together and life becomes more intense or more engaged with. And then but then you sort of try to do that, and then there might be something that blocks that, and that thing that blocks it is the situation, is the spectacle.
Mm-hmm.
And the spectacle then, whether that be something like the sort of image of Stalin, or it be the image of mass media, consumer society, or it just becomes this sort of separation between somehow you're not taking control of history, as it were, you're just sort of passively engaging with it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just trying to just provide a kind of almost it's almost like that's the sort of map.
Yeah, if you like. I mean, one distinction that I've tried to make in the past. Again, this isn't Debord. He doesn't make this distinction himself, but I think it just helps to clarify things. You could say there's the society of the spectacle, kind of a moment of life which he views as being completely kind of characterized by this kind of problem, and then the broader problem of spectacle, which could occur in lots of different kind of formations, lots of different kind of times. Mm-hmm. Many different kind of instances. The primary problem for him in this society is the commodity and everything that kind of follows from it. But he's also worried about religion. He's also worried about kind of revolutionary figureheads and kind of other forms of kind of fetishism and stuff like that.
Yeah. So drawing on the writings of Hegel, Marx, and Lukács, Debord can be seen as sort of developing an account of alienation. How should we understand this conception of alienation in Debord's work?
Right. But this is the question that I've been kind of dreading, because there's quite a lot of unpacking involved in that one. That's a bit like saying, what is alienation? How does alienation work in Hegel? How does it work in Marx? And how does it work in Lukács? Well, first of all, it's not just being depressed or feeling a bit angsty.
It's how it's sometimes used.
Yeah, it's a bit more than that. So it's not just, I feel sad. Alienation in this sense is a kind of separation from oneself, from one's own agency, or from the results. The classic kind of basis of all of this is in Hegel's philosophy. To characterize really quickly and really simply the way in which Debord is thinking about Hegel, super fast in this context, really, really, really briefly. This is not kind of the real Hegel at all, right? I'm painting in super broad brushstrokes. Debord has got a fairly traditional metaphysical understanding of Hegel, and it's not, I think it's really quite questionable. I think the more I get into this, the more I think he's actually not the best reader of Hegel, actually. But to really quickly characterize in simple terms a kind of traditional version of Hegel, you could say, you are a bit of the universe. You think about the universe. So in some teeny tiny minuscule sense, the universe becomes self-aware through you, right? You can accept that, right? Crude and stupid and all the rest of it. Hegel, a traditional metaphysical version of Hegel, scales that up massively and wants to say that the universe has a kind of a rational structure, and built into that rational structure is a kind of dynamism that develops towards increasing degrees of sophistication and complexity and self-consciousness. And this gives rise to kind of physical reality and kind of plants and animals and rational animals that develop over the course of historical time until they eventually get to the point where they can understand this fundamental kind of logic which underpins all things, right? So apologies to any kind of hardcore Hegelians, that's a rough and ready kind of version. What that means is when you think you're kind of the conscious subject is separated from the object that it's thinking about, there's actually a fundamental identity between the two, because the kind of the reason that's up here is actually fundamentally kind of out there. So alienation can be resolved in Hegel just by kind of realizing the identity between subject and object. That's one of kind of Marx's kind of criticisms later on. But what Hegel also does is he says, this becomes important after his death. He says all the kind of the philosophies of the past and all the religions of the past have all been kind of fuzzy attempts to get at kind of the truth that he's kind of pretty much revealed. Again, this is a traditional version of Hegel. And this is kind of important, really, because that means that religion is a representation of the deeper truth that philosophy accesses. And after Hegel's death, people get very excited about that. This is the kind of the beginnings of the young Hegelians. After Hegel's death, you get a split between the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians. The right Hegelians say, oh, Hegel's really good. He's kind of justified the bourgeois state. You know, it's all fabulous. And Christianity is the best religion in the world. Prussia is the best. Hurrah. I mean, we like Hegel. He's really good. He's given a big tick to the world. It's all fabulous. And the kind of the left Hegelians, or the so-called young Hegelians, so actually, if you look at this, there's quite a hardcore kind of atheist element to this, because it's implied that religion is just a representation of a deeper truth. And it's also implied that that deeper truth is us in some fundamental sense. Tied into this is a kind of a story about making the world more rational, transforming the world, all the rest of these kind of things. So they start drawing out of this a kind of a project of kind of transformation, kind of humanist kind of thing. Marx and Engels are in that gang, kind of the young Hegelian gang early on. And Marx is quite influenced by one of the young Hegelians called Feuerbach, who I mentioned earlier on, and the kind of a quick, simple, rough and ready picture of Feuerbach. He's taking this idea and saying, well, that when you worship religion, you're worshipping a representation of ourselves, of our own collective powers and capacities. The power and possibility and infinite fabulousness of God is just a representation of human beings, of what they can be and what they can do. That's a condition of alienation, if you like. You're separated from this thing, and actually it's yourself. Marx uses this in his early writings. When you've got the stuff in the manuscripts, Marx is like 24 years old or something, utterly obnoxious, and he writes all this kind of brilliant stuff about alienation. And in that story, you're going to get the idea very quickly there might be 4 different kinds of alienation, or the worker in the factory. Initially, he's talking about religion, and he says the young Hegelians have all got it wrong. They think you can just dispel religion by pointing out that it's a representation of human beings, but you can't. What you've really got to do is address the social relations that make people want religion in the first place. So you can't just criticize stuff, you need to actually make change. That's an important part of Marx's trajectory. But then he starts using this kind of like some of these ideas for thinking about kind of capitalism very early on. In the manuscript, you get this idea that the worker in the factory undergoes 4 different kinds of alienation. Because he's doing this just so he can get his wage, which he needs to go and buy the stuff he needs. That means all the people going to this factory are doing it individually, as individuals, to get what they want individually. So Marx says, well, they're also separated from each other in that sense. The workers are separated from each other, alienated from each other. The result of which arises from individual activity, but the individuals who produce it are somehow detached from it. That kind of idea is going to feed into Marx's later stuff about fetishism. When he writes Capital later on, you get this kind of elaborate story about how the operation of capital's value produces a society in which value rules the world. Ultimately, human beings are kind of subordinate to their own creations in some kind of fundamental sense. And if you follow this stuff through, you get Debord using a kind of a mixture of all these different things via a heavy dose of Lukács. Lukács is a kind of a Hungarian Marxist philosopher, writes a book called History and Class Consciousness in the 1920s, which reads the Hegelian elements of Marx's later work and kind of reconstructs what Marx was doing early on, and says, look, the basic problem is the workers need to become conscious of the fact that they're producing a way of life that they're subordinate to, ultimately. The human subjects have become subordinate to their own creations. They need to take conscious control of their own existence. They are making this way of life, and yet they're kind of dominated by it. But through revolution, they could take control of it and move onwards and do something different. You then have a condition of subject-object unity. Human subjects shape their own objective existence collectively and consciously onwards to the future, effectively. That's really where Debord comes out. He's reading Lukács in the late 1950s. He's also reading these early stuff in Marx's manuscript has been translated into French in the 1930s. He gets back into Hegel. He's reading all of this kind of package of stuff. And all of it feeds into this account of a society which is fundamentally characterized by alienation. But as I said, the simple picture of it really is, to summarize the whole thing, it's people becoming subordinate to their own collective powers and capacities due to the nature of the social relations in which they're operating. That, I think, is the fundamental problem. And the result of that problem is that they become detached from their own collective agency. Hence the need for stuff about history, hence also the stuff about constructing situations.
In Debord, it's the spectacle that's alienating us from something, from engaging in history or engaging in the historical process of historical change.
Yes.
On the one hand, and individual situations. transformation of individual situations.
That's supposed to be boring.
Yeah. So
Okay,
like the spectacle of how the city of Brighton functions, for example, and a lot of that is very boring. Someone flipping burgers at burger, but that's still part of the spectacle.
To go back to what I said earlier on about these different dimensions, right? The fundamental problem is you have a way of life which is ruled by the economy, right? We're not in charge of the world. The economy is in charge of us, right? You know, one simple way of doing this is think about the Frankenstein story, right? You know, Victor Frankenstein gives life to a monster and ends up dominating his life and making himself miserable, right? It's a sort of simple vision of some of what's happening in Marx, and it's a lot of what's happening in Debord. But here you get the idea that the social relations in which we exist, and then that's going to play out through the sparkle and glamour of TV screens and mobile phones and all the rest of these things, is going to play out through the tedium of doing shit jobs. But on the deepest level, which I think he's most concerned, the worry, why are these things a problem? Well, they're a problem because there's a worry about autonomy, right? And the story that I'm trying to sell is ultimately this is a story about collective autonomy.
And where spectacle feeds into that is at what level?
It's the whole package, right? Because this is why I said there are 3 levels. At least the way I understand it, because he says this in this letter, it's got 3 levels. It's kind of immediate kind of surface appearances of the sparkle and glamour of the TV screens and the rest of these things. It's a moment in the mode of production, but it's also historical reality. So ultimately, it's this moment and the problem posed by this moment. And the problem posed by this moment is ultimately a lack of collective autonomy. That problem plays out through dazzle, sparkle, nonsense. It's also going to play out through the tedium of jobs that you're describing. But the reason why these things are fundamentally a problem is a worry about collective autonomy. He's not just showing off. I think, in his mind, what he's really trying to do is describe and analyse the revolutionary possibility, the crux of this moment in time.
In your discussion of French Hegelianism, so the book actually goes into a lot of Debord's influences, and sort of French Hegelianism is kind of one of them. Discuss how Hegel's early works advanced the claim that religion, so this is a quote from your book, religion should be lived and felt rather than submitted to as if it were an external doctrine.
Yeah, according to Hegel.
Yes, yeah, according to Hegel. And then you note that those early views on love and religion would go on to form the basis of Hegel's later account of spirit. For just as God's will becomes concrete and manifest through the activity of the congregation, so too does spirit function in Hegel's mature philosophy as the means through which the absolute attains full self-conscious expression in the world. In what ways do these ideas, as developed in Hegel and French Hegelianism, influence the work of Debord?
Cut this one down to size a little bit, I think. And I think maybe the easy way to do that is simply to say, look, so Debord's getting interested in this material from the late 1950s onwards, and he's really invested in it from the 60s on through the 70s. And he reads an enormous amount. There's a line that I'm going to get it wrong now. He talks about how much he's read, and he really had. If you do go into the archive in Paris, and you can see he's been making these kind of reading then, all the stuff he was kind of getting through, and it's enormous. And it's kind of interesting because then you can see what he was reading, and you can also contact the library and say, what did he have in his personal library at the time of his death? So you can find out what he was actually reading and check up on it. And I've found in the past that you can make a bit more sense out of what he's saying if you look at some of the influences. But the stuff about religion sounds deeply weird in this context. The reason why Debord might have been reading it is because Hegel's early work is very romantic. Hegel comes out of romanticism in some respects, he's influenced by it. And some of his early stuff about religion is resonant in some regards with some of the stuff that Debord says later on. And people have kind of pointed out that some of the stuff that Hegel was saying about religion early on resembles, in some respects, some of the things the young Hegelians are saying about religion later. Not quite the same, but there are kind of echoes. And the basic worry is that Hegel doesn't like, this is the young Hegel talking about religion. He's worried about conditions in which God as some kind of absolute is separate from the worshippers, right? Stands over and above them in some regards, and the truth, the meaning, the purpose of the community is therefore kind of imposed upon them as a doctrine or a kind of a dogma. That's resonant with the idea of spectacle. Debord goes back and reads that and kind of recognises it. And what Hegel likes instead about Christianity, because he's a fan of Christianity, is that in Christianity, so the story goes, that kind of absolute truth, meaning, purpose, all the rest of it, God, becomes part of the life of the community. It ceases to stand over and above but it becomes part of the life of the congregation, and it's actualized in their interactions with each other through this idea of kind of mutual love and forgiveness and the rest of these kind of things. So obviously very, very religious, or quite traditional, kind of keen on Christianity and all the rest of things. And Debord is not keen on Christianity. He's absolutely not. But I was interested in the ways in which he's going back and he's reading that stuff. I suspect that when he was reading this stuff, he was kind of seeing echoes and resemblances. This kind of worry about that some kind of separated absolute stands over and above the community that it corresponds to. And against this, the idea that it should be actualized in their activity and in their conduct and interaction with each other.
How much do you think Debord engaged with sort of Rousseau? Because I'm thinking specifically about Rousseau's critique of the theatre. In the theatre, Rousseau critiques the theatre for being this kind of thing that you sort of passively engage with, rather than the festivals, which are this is a lecture on the theatre. So you kind of, so festivals are good because they kind of, everyone gets involved. And
very good book on Debord, written by Dada and Surrealism, which came out in English in '99, but had been previously published in Italian before that. T.J. Clarke, the art historian, wrote a very nice preface or forward to it. And he says that, I can't remember what the line is, but he does talk about the echoes between Debord and Rousseau. And I was, well, I better check that out. And I never really found that much in Debord's kind of writing. It's not something that he talked about. The final volume of his correspondence is really important because it's got a name index. And you can look at all the people referred to in the correspondence. So you can find all the letters where he talks about Clausewitz, all the letters where he talks about Machiavelli, which is great. I can't remember if I did that with Rousseau. Probably did. But I don't remember it kind of standing out as a big feature. But I think there are kind of similarities. There's a couple of bits in Society of the Spectacle, but the essence of it, this kind of time around the kind of the Renaissance period, there's a sense in which people can grasp the nature of political power, that Machiavelli is interesting and useful for us because he allows us to see how political power is operating. The book can't stand out to see.
Is there any French?
No. The one person he was polite about was a gambler. And I don't really understand that.
A gambler?
Yeah.
He's Italian.
But everyone else is just kind of scum, pretty much. He can't stand anyone.
Okay.
He's very funny sometimes, very, very rude.
I want, that rudeness, is that, because that's almost seems kind of, I suppose you could say the avant-garde is on one level, because you get like even like Dada, they write a manifesto that's rejecting Marinetti, for example, but you also get that with sort of Lenin happening as well. There's a kind of tradition of
Marx is incredibly catty.
So that's probably a sideline really, but
he has this kind of persona, particularly in his writing, of this kind of lordly contempt, and people have said that there's a kind of an aristocratic element in it. And one of the things I kind of regret is I didn't do more with Nietzsche. It's Hegel and Marx and Lukács, and then also Machiavelli, Clausewitz, that's all. But there's a bit of Nietzsche running through it, I think.
Because I know you mentioned Stirner, and I suppose, is it more Stirner than Nietzsche, or is Nietzsche?
I don't know. This is something I think I should have done. I mean, if you want to see the Nietzschean thing, it's probably Ralph Vanegan. He was the other kind of sort of secondary kind of theorist for the Situationists, and he wrote a book, came out the same year as Society of the Spectacle. Not as interesting, not as sophisticated, I don't think. Obviously, I'm biased, but I think there's a bit more kind of Nietzsche in that than there is in Debord. But this kind of lordly contempt, the kind of the aristocratic stuff, the emphasis on kind of art and life and all the rest of these things. Nietzsche's in the middle.
So Debord and the Situationists straddle both the classical sort of Marxist themes of workers' revolutionary movements and worker councils, and an almost sort of romantic refusal to work altogether on the other side. So there's an emphasis on sort of workers' movements on one side and worker councils, and then on the other hand, there's sort of refusal to work at all, and so, but with a more romantic connotation. How should we understand the relationship between Marxist and romantic themes of work and life in Debord and the Situationists' work more generally?
One way to get at this, there was a big kind of theme of criticism of the Situationists, certainly a few years back. If anyone wants to check it out, it's best summarised in the first edition of the Enray publication. Very, very good journal. They did a kind of a nice article right at the beginning called Bring Out Your Dead. And that's a nice overview of this position. But the position is essentially, there's a massive contradiction in the Situationists, because on the one hand, they say all power to the workers' councils, and on the other hand, they say never work. How does that work? That seems, how do these two things match up? And that's, many people who do versions of this kind of story, they say, you can do a kind of periodizing thing, and you say that reflects the fact that the Situationists are on the cusp of a break, which they didn't quite complete with fairly traditional kind of old school version of Marxism. And the traditional old school version of Marxism, according to this story, would be about, and I know this isn't fair, but to paint it in broad brushstrokes, that the affirmation of some kind of proletarian identity against the evil capitalist. It's all about workers' power and heroic work and the dignity of labour and onwards and upwards, as opposed to a different kind of story where you say the problem is not the capitalist, it's capital. We don't really want to affirm labour and all the rest of these things. We want to abolish labour. The problem is the way in which life becomes ruled and dictated by the abstractions of value. That's the kind of problem. So people use that. On the one hand, they seem to be keen on workers' councils. On the other hand, they say don't ever work, to kind of map out that kind of tension. I'm not sure that the tension exists in the same way that many people say, because I don't think they were keen on the workers' councils as an end in themselves. Debord, the fourth chapter of the Society of the Spectacle is a history of the workers' movement, and it ends with the endorsement of workers' councils. But that's simply because I think this is a means of social organisation which involves a minimum of separation and hierarchy and anything else like that. It's about collectivist anarchism, effectively. I think it is kind of what he's after, at least as I read him. And he's quite keen on the workers' councils as a kind of step towards that. If you look at his letters, he says, we're not interested in the councils as any kind of end in themselves. They're just what we need to do to manage bread and electricity and trains running and things like that, come the glorious revolution. But after that, we can get rid of them because we don't really want them forever. So I think it's a bit unfair to think he's just keen on workers' councils per se.
So is it sort of the equivalent to when Marx says about the withering away of the state?
Yeah, something.
He's wanting the councils as sort of the withering away of the council.
I think so. There's something like that. And the other dimension to this is that when the essay talk about the workers and the proletariat, they're a bit fuzzy about this. On the whole, I think they veer towards the view that what they're concerned with is what they refer to in a couple of their texts as the new proletariat. And the new proletariat, a bit different from Marx's classical. So the classical proletarian for Marx is someone who has no choice but to go and work for the boss, to go and get that which they need to kind of stay alive, essentially. That's the kind of classic kind of version. Someone who is separated from the means of independently producing their own means of existence. But I think the new proletariat for the Situationists are all those people separated from the means of independently shaping their own lives. What they're after is, what they're talking about is a more kind of existential notion. It's not, do I have enough to eat? Because this is taking place in the 50s and the 60s. They're looking at the kind of consumer society of this kind of time. They're seeing there's a new kind of poverty, the alleviation of the old material poverty as foreground in a new kind of poverty, which is the boredom and alienation that you were referring to earlier on. Right? This is a new kind of poverty, new kind of existential poverty. But this is not reducible to some kind of classical class position. It sort of extends across society. And this is quite close to the stuff that Castoriadis is saying in Socialism or Barbarie around the same kind of time, I think. Debord was briefly a member of Socialism or Barbarie. He takes some kind of ideas from them. And you end up with this rather simplistic vision, I think, of a tension between order givers and order takers, the people who want to change things and the people who don't. From some of the way in which that critique of the stuff about kind of workerism and councilism is quite right. But if you look into it, I think you find a different problem, which is that I don't think they're very good at talking about social relations which they're trying to diagnose, right? And the way I've tried to phrase that in the past is they have a kind of a political rejection of the primacy of labour. They want to get away from that. But I think in Debord, that takes into a kind of theoretical neglect of the importance of labour. He doesn't really quite pay enough attention to the social relationships based around kind of labour. The political position takes to kind of a theoretical position. Gildovo is quite good on this. He wrote a critique of the SI back in the 70s. And I can't remember how it goes, but I think he says something like Debord made a critique of the profound by means of the superficial or something like that. That in a sense, they're talking about effects and not doing enough to get to grips with the causes of those effects, right? Too focused on alienation, not quite engaged enough with the actual nuts and bolts which are giving rise to the alienation. To go back to the question earlier on about Plato's cave, and I tried to say what he's really trying to do is talk about kind of the whole revolutionary problematic of an entire moment. That kind of overall kind of perspective on this condition gives him this kind of primary focus on what I referred to a moment ago is this kind of existential poverty, which gives rise to a different kind of revolutionary demand. That's what I think he's kind of focusing on. And although he's reading his Marx carefully and all that kind of stuff, he's not cutting corners. I think nonetheless the overall picture is perhaps a bit more oriented towards effects than it is towards kind of causes. And there's quite a long history of people making that point, really, so I don't think I'm alone in that. There's also a long history of people getting very upset with people who make that point. So it's kind of controversial, but I think that's kind of what I thought.
This kind of distinction of two different types of alienation, one which is an alienation from what we produce, therefore. So that's kind of like a very practical kind of form of alienation. But then on the other hand, you've got an alienation which is far more kind of like an anxiety-based alienation, aggressive kind of one, in that we're alienated from our world, from our fellow human beings. And for me, even when Marx just tries to describe it as it's the alienation from what we produce, when you look at the kind of moral claim of why this is wrong, why are we behaving, why should this type of alienation not help us, right? Goes down to a problematic in Plato's Caves, and the Matrix does as well, about blue pill, red pill. You know, like is it the right thing to experience a reality which is more shit just because it's more real? Right, and I don't think that's more morally dubious about what's right or wrong to do. If everybody's happy but unalienated from their world, then that's one thing, and you can sort of debate whether that's right or wrong. But it's kind of the structure of our modern world which alienates people from other people, from any kind of fulfillment you have, but like something substantial, meaningful in their life. That becomes the ground on which you then have to try and make a. It's almost like that's the motivating force for why something like the Society of the Spectacle needs to be overturned. Right? This is what I was thinking earlier with your comment, is that when you were responding to me, is that actually the Foucauldian point is not particularly relevant, because you can see the misery that's created through a society which is based on spectacle.
Yes, I think I really agree with the second part of what you said. Right? I mean that's what I was referring to earlier on, for want of a better phrase, as a kind of existential poverty, not so much the kind of material poverty that of the past. And I think Debord has this kind of idea that, you know, all the revolutionary demands of the past have kind of been this one, right? He has remarks about that towards the end of the first chapter on time, where he says, in its demand to live the historical time that it creates, the proletariat recognises the unforgettable core of its own demand, something like that. I forget how it goes. But I think what he means there is the demand for means of subsistence, you know, all the rest of these kind of things, better conditions, ultimately their demands to take control of their time. But that's now become foregrounded within a society fundamentally characterised by dissatisfaction, alienation, boredom, disconnection, so on and so on and so forth. And that's given rise to this new, the poverty of the past may have been alleviated, but it's actually given rise to something more radical. Rather than dissolving the radical demand, it's given rise to a more radical demand. I think it is basically the situationist position. And it's also worth remembering how this ties back to because we don't want to lose the avant-garde stuff that you were asking about earlier on, right? This stuff does go back into it, right? Or rather, it comes from that. The early demand to create situations, to construct and shape moments of lived time, has now turned into this, right? But it's now being framed as the demand, the revolutionary demand of a particular kind of moment in time, of a context. Here we are in 1967. We need to construct situations. Has become. Here we are in 1967. We need to overthrow the society. I mangled that last bit, but I think you see what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
They ask a question about Henri Lefebvre's moments. How much do Henri Lefebvre's moment theory influence Debord's theory of the construction of situations? For me, nothing, but I know many people who see a big influence. And for you, and how much the bad French translation of Marx's Capital has had an impact on Debord's Hegelian lecture of Marx, The French version, for example, doesn't differentiation from value and exchange value, and the same in Debord. The only decent translation will arrive in French in the 1980s with J.P. Lefebvre.
Okay, that second part of that question is really interesting. I don't know what I think about that. I just generally don't know. And I'd like to continue that conversation. So if the person asking that question wants to send me an email, I'd be really interested to pursue that. That sounds great. The first part of the question about Lefebvre, there's a sort of cross-pollination between Debord and Lefebvre for a while. Debord was reading Lefebvre really quite early on because Lefebvre was kind of big and established and all the rest of the stuff. And Debord is reading some of his early stuff. The first volume of the Critique of Everyday Life comes out in 1947 or something like that, so Debord would have read that. The second volume of the Critique of Everyday Life, it's Lefebvre's Critique of Everyday Life, is produced around the time that Debord and Lefebvre are mates, and they're friends for a while. They have a kind of, they're kind of hanging out together, and Lefebvre is quite close to the Situationists. Then they split, as is always the case with Debord. The split is horrible. They just don't speak. This is another one of Debord's things. This kind of, he just absolutely cuts people off. Ostensibly, the dispute with Lefebvre was about plagiarism, about a set of theses about the Paris Commune, which the Situationists felt Lefebvre nicked from them. And they both kind of accused each other of plagiarism. But the second volume of the Critique of Everyday Life comes out, or is written during the time that they're hanging out together. And because they're hanging out together, it's very hard to say who influenced who. I mean, from what I remember, it's been a long time since I read it. The second volume has got quite a lot of stuff in there about strategy, and you've got that section at the end of it where you're talking about moments. So I think there's probably been a cross-pollination. But in terms of Debord's own position on it, he does have a critique of it. There's some letters in which he writes to other members of the Situationist International. He describes what he thinks wrong with it. Incredibly opaque. It's very, very hard to make sense of it. Really very, very enigmatic. And then one of the Situationists, not Debord, wrote those notes up into an article which was published in International Situationist. But the article isn't that much more help. Basically, the essence of it, if I remember rightly, essentially Lefebvre is wrong. Lefebvre doesn't take it far enough. You need to create situations, not moments. Lefebvre's moments are things that kind of happen to you. What we need to do is kind of make something more. But I forget the details of how the critique works. So in answer to the question, there's kind of cross-pollination, I think. They're influenced by each other. But it's very much his own man, really. He's pretty steadfast in all that. And he's got some quite sharp criticisms of theory of moments.
I mean, on one level, you can sort of read Debord as a kind of just sort of using sort of Machiavellian means end sort of rationality to kind of achieve particular ends.
Sort of Machiavellian in the bad sense.
Yes, yeah. You sort of suggest a sort of different kind of reading. So your book draws out ways in which strategy is sort of intimately tied to or associated with sort of dialectics and requires a kind of unity of means and ends. So what strikes me as interesting in this account is that strategy almost becomes dialectics itself. It's something beyond mere manoeuvring. Just as dialectics would sort of link the particular with the universal, strategy can sort of be understood in terms of the particular strategy or strategic maneuvers deployed in a particular situation, and the universal sort of strategy as dialectics or strategy as a sort of ethics. So how should we understand Debord's engagement with strategy, and how would this affect how strategy is deployed?
But why is he so fussed about strategy? And he says, I said earlier on, Agamben's about the only one that he kind of gives a pass to. Agamben's kind of been eating out on that for a while, and sort of continue kind of referring to my mate Debord. In one of those kind of texts, he says, when I was hanging out with Debord, I said to him, you're a philosopher, aren't you? And Debord says, no, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a strategist. But I think there's quite a lot behind that. If you look at what he says elsewhere in his kind of letters and all the other bits and bobs, I think the attempt to say, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a strategist, is quite important. And I think it goes back to this idea of the realization of philosophy that he's very interested in Marx fairly early on. And the theme of the realization, if we talk about the realization of art earlier on, the realization of philosophy, that's a thing for Debord. So what is the realization of philosophy in Marx? It essentially comes out of the critique of young Hegelians and the stuff about religion. The idea is it's not enough to just kind of criticize what's wrong. Critical thought needs to become a practical force within the world. And I think for Debord, when critical thought becomes a practical force within the world, it becomes strategy, right? It becomes strategic. Also wedded to the way in which he's understanding Marx's relation to Hegel. Now, I don't think this is necessarily the right way to think about the relationship between Marx and Hegel. I think Marx goes back and uses Hegel loads of different ways throughout the course of his life. I don't think you can summarise it in one particular way. But the one way that's important for Debord is he's got a funny reading of the famous line about standing Hegel on his head and the inversion. And it's not, this is thesis 18, the Science of the Spectacle. It's really quite, well, he says, look, what's important is not replacing an unfolding series of categories for an unfolding series of historical social frameworks. What's important is reversing an orientation towards the past and turning it into an orientation towards the future. This comes out of some of the stuff he says elsewhere, his remarks about Tchaikovsky and things like this. But the essence of the picture is that Hegel has given us a way of thinking about history and historical change, but he's done that from within a philosophy which basically declares the world to be finished and complete, and it's orientated towards the past. What Marx does comes along and turns that around, according to Debord, and he pulls out that way of thinking about historical change and transformation and says we need to use this as a way of thinking about how to make the future. So essentially it becomes about praxis. Dialectics as a way of thinking about change and movement and interaction and the rest of these things is pulled out of Hegel and used as a way of thinking about how to conduct change. And that's why I think he associates dialectics with strategy. And he's really explicit about this. In one of the notes in the archive, he says to think dialectically and to think strategically is the same thing. And this is why I think he says one of the most famous but really ambiguous lines in Society of Spectacles, workers need to become dialecticians. Right? I think that means workers need to become strategists, right? Because they shouldn't be following the leader. They need to kind of figure things out for themselves. If you want to avoid spectacle, you need to avoid hierarchy, domination, leadership, all the rest of these kind of things. They need to take charge. So strategy, I think, is really quite important. It's certainly how he identifies himself. It's how he thinks about his own theory. He's not giving you sociological analyses of a particular moment in time. He's trying to make interventions which are contributions towards attempts to change a moment of time. He sees himself as a strategist in that regard. The bit about how do we, what should we think about this and all the rest of this stuff? I don't know. The one that sticks in my mind is one of the final bits of the 1988 book, Comments on the Society of the Spectacle, where there's a long discussion, not long, fairly short actually, but there is a discussion of Napoleonic warfare and changes in weaponry giving rise to different kinds of tactics, right? And the kind of play between the two. And he then goes from there and says, look, here we are in 1988, and we have the new advances made by spectacular society, the emphasis on kind of surveillance, domination, and this is all taking on new forms. We must expect power, the operational power, to take advantage of this, right? People who want to kind of run the show are going to look at the means at their disposal, they're going to take advantage of it. And we can expect to see on the horizon the rise of a kind of a cast of characters who are surfing the waves of this distracted, confused, messed up society in various ways. Not off the mark.
Was it Debord who made a board game, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But I think the board game's not as, considering what he wrote, right? Board game's very classical warfare kind of orientated.
Yes.
There are some really good board games that are probably actually as subtle as what he's trying to get across.
Well, yeah, I mean, no doubt. And it's been a long time since I played the board one. It's got a bit too much maths in it for me, really. I'm a bit crap with that. But it's good, it's tricky. I think he saw it as I think it's like Barbrook who says it's a kind of Clausewitz simulator. I think it might be Barbrook's phrase. But yeah.
Where can you pick it up? Waterspace.
Well, I mean, there's copies of it floating around on the internet.
But also, I don't know if you speak to Barbara, because they do the class war games.
Yeah.
So they they go around and actually you can play it with people.
Cool.
So they had it in 2019, I think, when we had World Transformative, they came and played it. It does go around.
It does, yeah, but it was Atlas Books, I think, did a publication of it around 2008, 2009, something like that. The publication, you've got the rule book, and then there's a sort of, the rest of it is a description of a game that he's played with his wife, and then you've got the counters and all the rest of it. Yeah, but it's...
So it is kind of a recreation, what Richard's bringing around now.
Yes.
It's kind of like a recreation based on, though.
I've seen him do that a long time ago, but they had a kind of a mock-up of the original version of it. But it's meant to be Napoleonic warfare.
Oh, did you want to come back to question Machiavelli? Yeah.
The way you sort of framed it makes me think of the reasons why Arendt likes Machiavelli, and she likes Machiavelli because she thinks that he treats politics for its own sake, which is actually kind of contrary to that means-end calculus kind of thing. It's kind of like politics is an end in itself, and the strategy is kind of like it is a part of that. It's not really a means to an end. It's just that is part of what politics is. And I think
sorry, just to help me do this, I think I can see where you're going. But when you say what politics is, could you just say what that is? Sorry, that's not being obnoxious.
I think the is doing a lot of burden carrying in that. The being in this sort of politics sort of. This is probably making it more confusing, but like
power.
Yeah,
to do with the objective of gaining power.
No, because I think that's again kind of like treating it kind of as a means end. So the reason why Ren likes is because politics isn't about something like power. It's about creating some kind of collective engagement, and that's kind of where she thinks Machiavelli is really good.
Okay.
Because he's trying to like foster some kind of. So if you go beyond Prince and you look into discourses and stuff like that, it's doing something a bit more broad about a collective kind of consciousness.
Well, Debord was reading all that. He's doing all the kind of Machiavelli stuff. He refers to Machiavelli, Clausewitz, and Sun Tzu as doing dialectical strategic thought. So there's dialectics in Machiavelli, apparently. Maybe this isn't where you're going. I'm not as good on the rent as I should be. I don't know what she says about Machiavelli. But I mean, the general picture I get from her end about when she thinks about politics is it's the continual kind of problem of figuring out what we're going to do, how we're going to interact, what we're going to get up to. It's kind of collective life as it kind of plays out through clashes and interactions and things like this, right?
But it's also freedom,
right?
And it's also acting together.
Right, but then I think for Debord, this whole story about strategy is a way of thinking about the conduct of life, right? And again, if you go back to what I was trying to, I made it too complicated earlier on, but the story is essentially making lived time a collective self-conscious project.
I think that's it, right? That's the point I was going to get at. Collective. How do you have in order to create it, you need some kind of going between people. In order to foster some kind of...
Yeah, this is going off the tangent of your question a little bit. But one thing I got really interested in, I've always wanted to go back to and try and make a bit more sense out of, is one of the many ambiguous things he says. He talks about life as opposed to non-life, right? But what does that mean, right? There's different interpretations. But it seems, if you look at the quotations, you put them all together and you think about what he was reading and the rest of it, these might have felt. Is life, in this sense, is the interrelation of collective, particular people as they play out together and interact and operate and all the rest of it. Non-life is some kind of stagnation, fragmentation, all the rest of it. So to think dialectically in that sense is rendering collective historical life a self-conscious affair.
So like non-life could then be sort of viewed as being stunned by the spectacle.
Well, it is the condition of spectacle. Yeah, and that's important because you said earlier on that you mentioned Plato's cave, and you said it's the images on the wall. And what I want to stress, this as I understand it, is not, it's the predicament. Right? So it's not just what we see, these flipping images, it's the predicament. Right, and then to resolve that predicament is life.
Towards the end of the book, you write, it remains the case that simply transposing Debord and the Situationist International's work into our contemporary conditions would jar with the conception of time and history that support it. In consequence, those more foundational concerns with temporality and agency may deserve rather more attention than they have as yet received. So how should we approach situationists in our time?
Okay, so there's two things there. One is this idea that you can't simply transpose this theory from 1967 and paste it onto the present. That needs to be unpacked. And then there's also this idea that maybe there's something worth getting hold of. The second bit's easier, and that's really straightforward. And I do think Debord is really underappreciated, much richer and much more interesting than it's often taken to be. Right? I'm pretty convinced about that. A lot of people who are keen on Benjamin, right, for example, these kind of peculiar poetic ambiguous, difficult, kind of spiky, slightly kind of goth philosophy kind of stuff, right? And I mean, you'd like Debord, right? He's much more philosophically nuanced, he's much more interesting, there's much more in there than is often assumed to be the case, and I think it's worth pulling it out and trying to understand it. The bit about transposing theory from the past, well, that's if he's a strategist, and if the theory that he's setting out is a kind of a strategic analysis of a particular moment in time, he wouldn't be a very good general if he used the same battle plan in each and every circumstance, right? And it's kind of as simple as that. And in fact, if you did it because you thought that this guy had all the answers, or you thought that the Situationist International was some kind of timeless body of theory, you would be treating it as an instance of spectacle in the way I'm understanding it, insofar as it becomes a kind of figurehead or talisman, a kind of a localized point upon which agency is transposed and fixated. Right? So it would be a mistake in that case. So that means the only way to address it is to go back and look at it and pull it apart and see what to make of it. So what do you do when you go back and look at it and see what to make of it? I think one thing you could do, if you're interested in art, is go back and look at the first part of the Situationist International, before the split of 62. There's a book, you can get a PDF of it floating around on the internet. It's called Expect Everything, Fear Nothing, or something like that. Fear, expect, some combination. But it's good. It's a series of essays which are all saying what we need to do is pull the SI out from the shadow of Debord's overly theoretical influence and look at the kind of the early avant-garde kind of dramatic stuff that they're doing before 62. Personally, I think what we need to do is pull Debord out from underneath his own shadow, because he's more interesting than people take him to be, but that's my own. I think the bits of the theories that the more I fiddle around with it, the more I find it a bit troubling. Became quite taken by, there's a guy called Daniel Lopez, he did a very good book on Lukács recently. And one of the things he says, this idea of subject-object unity, you get in Lukács, the proletariat taking conscious charge of their own existence, his history becoming a self-conscious project. That's a bit like becoming God or something like that. There's something about touching the divine that might be a bit disturbing. And I think that's right. And I think there's a bit of that in Debord. I know I've become more convinced by that this idea of kind of history becoming self-conscious, you know, actualizing and uniting with some kind of fundamental kind of collective power and capacity being, there's a bit like, and if that's tied to a story about revolution, it's starting to sound a little bit like a holy war, particularly when you have this incredibly uncompromising refusal to accept any form of kind of separated social power and the rest. Recently, I've become a bit more persuaded. So that's now, I think, the way in which I would want to address it. But I do think the stuff he says about history and the diagnosis of a society that has a very strange conception of history matters, I think. And I would want to look at that through the stuff he says in 1988 about the comments on the society of spectacle, I think. And I think that would be a way in which I can look at it now.
Have you seen any good interpretations of like particularly art that have taken on something that you would consider philosophy?
It's difficult, really, because he's so uncompromising. And the position he's taken up is if you are doing art nowadays in some kind of collective art, some kind of art world, and gallery system and all the rest of it, then you're a terrible backsliding trades working classes, and this is awful, right? So I mean, he's pretty much got himself into that kind of position. But there is an influence. And I mean, I don't know this stuff because I've never really focused too much on the art side of things. I've been too preoccupied with all this kind of fiddly stuff. But I know, you know, Claire Bishop and the people around that kind of stuff got quite influenced by it, and many other people have too in other ways. There's also ways of talking about how it kind of had an impact on broader culture as well. It's really old book now, but Grail Marcus's old book, Lipstick Traces, talks about a kind of a current which goes all the way through kind of 19th century romanticism, through Dada and Surrealism, through the Situationists on into punk. And you can think about it in those terms, because it was indeed taken up by the UK anarcho scene in a very big way. It has a kind of series of different kinds of afterlife. It's revolution and nothing, like you, because he's so uncompromised. He always wants to take the most extreme position. That's not necessarily how one should read or use him, but I think that's where he was.
There's also two questions on online. Do you share Eric John Russell's reading of Debord's Hegelianism? In my opinion, Debord is not that close to Adorno and his negative dialectics.
Eric John is a mate. He is. He's a friend. very fond of Eric John. I don't agree with everything that he says, and Eric John doesn't agree with everything I say. We've got different kind of takes on it. So Eric John thinks I'm, I think, because we won't get to the bar, the short version is, for Eric John, the key to the way you think about Debord's use of Hegel is the science of logic, and how the science of logic plays out through Marx's mature stuff in Capital. I think that gives you a very useful and interesting way of reading Debord, and it puts Debord in connection to the Frankfurt School. It does allow you to do that kind of stuff. People disagree, but I don't think that is Debord. If you look at his reading notes, he's got lots and lots of reading notes on the phenomenology of spirit, on Hegel's early works, but there's almost nothing on the science of logic. There's a couple of bits from the introduction, and there's one note later on in the text, but Debord's reading notes in Marx and Hegel were published recently. And if you, the editors have made a little footnote, and they said that we couldn't find this bit that Debord has copied out in the version of the science of logic that Debord was using. So he hasn't actually found it in the science of logic. He's found it in someone else talking about the science of logic. So I don't think that reading Debord's use of Hegel through the logic, although I think it might be very, very productive and very useful and a good way of doing something with him nowadays, but I don't know that it's what Debord himself was doing, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why I got a bit of distance from Eric John. But I really like and respect his work. I think it's really good.
Stephen asks, the interesting thing about Debord's game is the importance it places on maintaining communication infrastructures, which my impression is fairly unique among war games. Damien also asks, I enjoyed Tom's book. My own research is examining the prospect of the tournament of just transition, how we move from a capitalist carbon-based society to a post-capitalist, post-carbon-based society. I think we need to return to Debord and Situationists because we need to learn the practice of revolt. I was wondering if Tom had any thoughts on Debord's writing in The Sick Planet and its relevance to the current climate emergency.
I think that, yeah.
Would you like me to go get your drink?
If you wouldn't mind, that'd be great.
Say the same again.
I'm going to run out of things to say by the time we get back there.
Okay,
Absolutely the right kind of question to ask. I'm not sure that the stuff Debord says in that book is really on the money. If I remember rightly, it's a really trite final line. I think he says something like, capitalism makes it rain, revolution makes the sunshine, or something like that. And it seems a little bit kind of feeble, really. And perhaps a more sensible way of thinking about that question would be to say, if you can figure this guy as being fundamentally concerned with time and history and wanting to say that this is a society that's got some kind of flawed relationship to history, and if you also want to say that history is not just thinking about the past, but something that happens, something that we do, something that we need to sort of think about clearly, collectively and consciously, then climate change would seem to be quite important. Right? I mean, that could be one of the fundamental pathologies of this society, that it has such a flawed relationship to its own predicament, to its own future, to its own existence in time, that it has a very, very grim future looming in front of it, but is set up in such a way that it's very hard to do anything about it. And that might be something you can do with Debord, perhaps through the comments on the society perspective, given that it's in the text.
That makes me quite Heideggerian then, like sort of Dasein being towards the future, being towards death.
Well, there is a big existential element in this, right? Because it's coming out of some of that stuff. He's not a big fan of Heidegger. There's a remark in a letter. He writes a letter to the editor of a journal with some kind of Heideggerian buzzword as its title, and there's a remark about not having failed to recognise Heidegger for what he was. So there's that, and the whole thing about the relation between art and life and Debord means he's very concerned with one's own comportment. This is again the Nietzschean thing, right? And what you say and what you do need to be quite closely tied together. The simple fact that Heidegger signed up to the Nazis means he's out. Yeah, pretty much.
If this is the end of the discussion, then I just want to say thank you to Tom for coming along and talking to us.
Thank you. It's very kind. I'm genuinely very glad to be here. It's nice. Yeah, I'm sorry if this has been a bit chunky. It's quite hard to unpack some of the stuff Bradley's asking, but yeah, thanks. Very good questions.
You explained it very well to a non-philosopher. You did.
It's very kind. Thank you.
Yeah, I wouldn't apologise. It was very interesting.